September 2nd, 1984, Father's Day in Sydney. What was supposed to be a simple motorcycle swap meet was about to become a bloodbath. At the Viking Tavern in Milperra, families browsed bike parts. Kids played between the stalls. Fathers showed off their machines. Everything seemed normal. Then the Comancheros arrived, 19 strong, armed and angry. Minutes later, their rivals rolled in, the Bandidos, 34 bikers, ready for war, 2 motorcycle clubs, 1 parking lot, decades of hatred about to explode. Within seconds, fists flew. Then came the guns. Shotgun blasts tore through the air. Automatic weapons erupted. The suburban quiet shattered under a storm of bullets and screams. When the smoke finally cleared, the toll was devastating. 7 lives lost, 4 Comancheros, 2 Bandidos, and a 14-year-old girl caught in the crossfire. Another 28 people lay wounded. It wasn't just another clash between outlaw bikers. It was Australia's deadliest biker shootout, a bloody confrontation that stunned the nation and changed how the country viewed motorcycle gangs forever. Why 2 clubs went to war. The Milperra Massacre didn't happen out of nowhere. Just a year earlier, in 1983, the Comancheros, one of Australia's most feared motorcycle clubs, split apart. Internal disputes reached boiling point when a faction broke away under Anthony Snodgrass Spencer. Rather than disappear into the shadows, this group sought power. They reached across the Pacific, aligning with the Bandidos Motorcycle Club in Texas, a move that gave them international backing and instant credibility. By November 1983, the Bandidos officially planted their first flag outside the United States, right in Australia. This wasn't just a new name on the scene, it was a declaration of war. What had been a single club was now 2 rival empires sharing the same streets. On one side stood Jock Ross, the hardline leader of the original Comancheros, known for his strict discipline and militaristic style. On the other, Spencer, fueled by resentment and the promise of Bandido muscle, was determined to prove his breakaway wasn't a mistake. By 1984, the stage was set. Old brothers were now sworn enemies. Personal feuds mixed with questions of honor and pride, ensuring that the split would not be settled quietly. Conflict wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. The slow boil, weeks before the shootout. By the middle of 1984, Sydney was a city on edge. The split between Comancheros and the new Bandidos wasn't just a rivalry, it was a countdown. Week after week, confrontations flared across pubs, biker hangouts, and suburban streets. Members from both sides were seen circling each other's territory, words exchanged in public, fists flying behind closed doors. Neither club was willing to back down. The Comancheros, under Jock Ross, armed themselves with shotguns, rifles, and military-style discipline. Across town, the Bandidos matched them step for step, gathering their own cache of firearms and determined to show their Texas-born colors carried weight in Australia. The atmosphere grew tense and unmistakably dangerous. Informants later told police that both clubs were preparing not just for intimidation, but for open warfare. Every gathering, every run, carried the possibility of exploding into something much worse. By late August, the city's underworld could feel it. Milperra wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. Father's Day, hour by hour. September 2nd, 1984, began like any other Father's Day in suburban Sydney. At the Viking Tavern in Milperra, families and motorcycle enthusiasts gathered for a swap meet organized by the British Motorcycle Club. The event was meant to be lighthearted, a chance to trade bike parts, talk machines, and enjoy a day out. But under the surface, the air was tense. Everyone in Sydney's motorcycle world knew the Comancheros and the newly formed Bandidos were circling each other. What no one realized that morning was just how close the tension was to snapping. By around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the uneasy calm broke. A convoy of 19 Comancheros rolled into the car park. They weren't there to shop for spare parts. They came in formation, their presence deliberate and heavy. Witnesses later recalled how they spread out quickly across the grounds. Walkie-talkies crackled in their hands as they took up positions around the tavern and along the parking lot's edges. It was a tactic that carried the feel of a military maneuver. an attempt to control the terrain before their rivals could even arrive. Their show of force sent a message. This was their ground, and they were ready to defend it. Not long after, the sound of engines filled the street once again. This time, it was the Bandidos, 34 strong, rumbling into the same car park. They came with numbers that outmatched the Comancheros, and with the confidence of a club determined to assert itself. Many of the men carried weapons concealed in jackets or hidden in their vehicles, guns, chains, and knives. To the families wandering between stalls, the sudden arrival of so many leather-clad bikers was jarring. What looked at first like a show of strength was about to spiral into something deadly. Within minutes, the two groups faced each other across the tavern's lot. Shouts cut through the air, insults traded back and forth as tempers flared. Then, in an instant, the standoff crossed the line. The first gunshot cracked, startling everyone within earshot. Panic rippled across the swap meet as men, women, and children ducked for cover. What followed was chaos. Bikers pulling out pistols, shotguns, and rifles, firing in the open air of a crowded suburban parking lot. The firefight was fast, loud, and indiscriminate. Spent shells clattered on the asphalt, while bullets tore through cars, stalls, and even the tavern's walls. Some bikers used parked vehicles as cover, crouching low to fire back. Others rushed forward, swinging blunt weapons or engaging at close range. Ordinary people, caught in the wrong place at the worst possible time, scrambled to escape the line of fire. In less than half an hour, Milperra had transformed from a Father's Day gathering into a battleground. The British Motorcycle Club's casual swap meet was now the stage for the bloodiest confrontation in Australia's outlaw motorcycle history. The shooting had begun, and once it started, there was no stopping the chain of violence that would define that day forever: the casualties and the bystander. As the gunfire tore across the Milperra car park, lives were lost in minutes. When the shooting finally eased, 7 people lay dead. Among them were 4 Comancheros and 2 Bandidos, men who had once called each other brothers, but now fell in a fight that turned club rivalry into open slaughter. But the death that shook the nation most was not a biker's. 14-year-old Leanne Walters, a local girl who had come to the swap meet with friends, was struck in the chest by a stray bullet. She had no part in the conflict, no reason to be in the line of fire. Her killing made the violence impossible to frame as just a war between gangs. For Australians watching the news that night, her name became the symbol of just how reckless and brutal the shootout had been. Beyond the dead, the toll of injuries was staggering. 28 people were wounded, many from gunshots, others from beatings or flying debris. Survivors spoke later of chaos, bullets zipping past their heads, cars peppered with holes, families dragging children to the ground to shield them. Some ran into the tavern, others fled into nearby streets, leaving belongings behind. What was meant to be a community event looked more like a war zone. Eyewitnesses remembered the sheer panic, the smell of gunpowder in the air, the screams of people trying to escape, and the sight of bodies lying between scattered bike parts. The violence was so sudden and so extreme that it stunned the country. This wasn't hidden gang warfare in back alleys. It was a suburban bloodbath in broad daylight, with ordinary people caught in the crossfire. The death of Leanne Walters ensured that the Milperra Massacre would never be seen as just another clash of outlaw bikers. It became a national tragedy, one that forced Australia to confront the cost of letting 2 violent clubs wage war unchecked: lockdown, first response, and the crime scene. When the shooting finally stopped, the scene around the Viking Tavern looked like a battlefield. Within minutes, police units from across Sydney converged on Milperra. Officers arriving first were met with a nightmare. Bodies sprawled across the car park, wounded men staggering or shouting, weapons scattered everywhere, and terrified bystanders still trying to escape. The first priority was control. Police quickly sealed off the precinct, shutting down surrounding streets to keep more bikers from flooding in. The Viking Tavern and its car park became a lockdown crime scene. Every man inside was ordered to the ground, searched, and handcuffed if necessary. Officers confiscated handguns, rifles, shotguns, even homemade weapons left on the asphalt. By the end of that afternoon, dozens of firearms had been seized, evidence of just how heavily armed both sides had come. At the same time, paramedics and volunteer first aiders fought to stabilize the wounded. Makeshift triage zones were set up beside cars and in the tavern itself. Ambulances struggled to get through the cordon fast enough to transport the most critical patients. Many of the injured bikers refused to cooperate, unwilling to give police any information, even as they bled. Yet doctors and nurses in nearby hospitals later described wards filled with rival gang members, some still glaring at each other from neighboring beds. For police, it was clear this wasn't just another pub fight gone wrong. It was a full-scale gun battle in a suburban neighborhood. Detectives and crime scene officers began photographing, tagging, and collecting hundreds of pieces of evidence: bullet casings, damaged vehicles, and discarded weapons. Witness statements were taken on the spot from terrified civilians who had seen the shootout unfold. That day's immediate lockdown laid the groundwork for what would become one of the largest investigations in Australian criminal history. The Milperra Massacre was not going to be handled quietly. From the start, the police response signaled that the justice system would treat it as a turning point. The mega trial, the Milperra Massacre, did not end at the crime scene. It carried straight into the courts. What followed was one of the largest joint criminal trials in New South Wales history. Dozens of bikers from both the Comancheros and the Bandidos were arrested and charged, not just as individuals, but under a powerful legal principle: the doctrine of common purpose. In plain terms, it meant that anyone who took part in the ambush and armed clash could be held equally responsible for the deaths, regardless of who fired the fatal shots. The courtroom soon became a spectacle in itself. Rows of accused bikers appeared in the dock, their lawyers facing off against a prosecution determined to make an example of them. The trial stretched on for months, with mountains of ballistic evidence, medical reports, and witness testimony, painting a grim picture of how a simple swap meet had turned into a bloodbath. Jurors listened to stories from civilians who had seen bullets tear through the car park, and from police who described the sheer scale of weaponry seized that day. The verdicts reflected the gravity of the crime. 9 men were convicted of murder, while 21 others were found guilty of manslaughter. Dozens more faced convictions on weapons and related charges. The sentences varied, but for many, it meant long years in prison. Importantly, the trial underscored that in Australia, outlaw motorcycle gangs would be pursued collectively. No one could hide behind the idea of being a bystander once they had chosen to ride with their club that day. Media coverage was relentless. Headlines dubbed it the Milperra Massacre trial, and public outrage over the violence ensured that every detail was broadcast. For the families of the victims, especially the Walters family, mourning 14-year-old Leanne, the convictions were a measure of justice, though they could never undo the loss. By the time the verdicts were read, the message was clear. The state was prepared to use the full weight of the law against biker gangs, and Milperra had become the defining example. Leadership in the dock. At the center of the Milperra trial was William Jock Ross, the Scottish-born founder of the Comancheros Motorcycle Club. Ross had established the club in Sydney in 1968 after serving in the British Army, bringing with him a strict sense of hierarchy and discipline. For years, he ruled the Comancheros with military-style authority, demanding loyalty and punishing dissent. This rigid leadership style was one of the sparks that led to the split in 1983, when a breakaway chapter left under Anthony "Snotty" Spencer and soon aligned with the Bandidos. By Father's Day 1984, Ross was not just a club leader, he was a battlefield commander. Prosecutors argued that his decisions before and during the Milperra clash carried legal weight. Under the doctrine of common purpose, Ross's leadership role meant he shared responsibility for the violence that erupted. Witnesses testified to his presence at the swap meet, his coordination of Comanchero members, and the confrontational posture his men adopted as they circled the grounds with walkie-talkies before the shooting began. In the courtroom, Ross became a symbol of what the state saw as the dangers of outlaw motorcycle leadership, a single man whose choices escalated club rivalry into mass bloodshed. Ultimately, he was convicted of multiple counts, including manslaughter, and sentenced to prison. To the public, his downfall carried extra weight. Here was the founder of one of Australia's oldest outlaw clubs, now shackled in the dock, paying the price for leading his men into the deadliest biker shootout the country had ever seen. gun law shockwave, the Milperra Massacre did not just leave bodies on the ground, it sent shockwaves through New South Wales politics. In the months that followed, the scale of the gunfight, automatic shotguns and pistols blazing in a suburban car park, forced lawmakers to admit that the state's firearms laws were too weak. In 1985, the New South Wales Parliament passed urgent reforms through amendments to the Firearms and Dangerous Weapons Act. The changes were sharp and direct. Licensing was tightened, background checks became more rigorous, and the casual carrying of guns in public places faced new restrictions. One of the clear lessons from Milperra was that outlaw motorcycle clubs had been able to stockpile and openly use weapons with little oversight. The amendments sought to close those gaps, giving police stronger powers to monitor and restrict firearm ownership. For the first time, the state began treating access to guns not as a casual right, but as a privilege that came with strict controls. These reforms are often remembered as a turning point. While Australia had always had some form of gun regulation, Milperra made the problem of organized groups with firepower impossible to ignore. The 1985 changes did not end the problem of illegal firearms, but they set a precedent. Major bloodshed would trigger stronger laws. That precedent re-emerged a decade later, on a much larger stage. In 1996, after the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania, the Commonwealth and the states signed the National Firearms Agreement, introducing uniform licensing, registration, and bans on semi-automatic weapons. Many historians of Australian law draw a line from Milperra to Port Arthur. Two tragedies, each shifting the national debate about guns. Milperra's legacy, then, was not only about gangs or trials. It reshaped how an entire state thought about weapons. It proved that what happened in one car park could ripple into the law books and permanently alter the country's approach to firearms. How policing changed Milperra was not only a tragedy, it was a wake-up call for law enforcement in Australia. Before 1984, police often treated biker gangs as fringe troublemakers, stepping in only after violence broke out. The scale of the massacre changed that mindset completely. Suddenly, outlaw motorcycle clubs were no longer just rebellious riders. They were armed organizations capable of urban warfare. In the immediate aftermath, New South Wales police began building new strategies that moved away from short bursts of enforcement toward continuous pressure. Dedicated task forces were created to track outlaw clubs around the clock. Surveillance became a permanent fixture. Phone taps, undercover operatives, and even aerial monitoring were deployed to map networks and anticipate violence before it erupted. Another major shift was the cultivation of informants. Where once biker codes of silence seemed impossible to penetrate, Milperra proved that intelligence gathering could save lives. Over time, police developed specialized units skilled at flipping insiders and building long cases that targeted leadership as well as rank and file. This was an enduring operational change. In later decades, when other major operations like Strike Force Raptor in New South Wales or National Task Forces emerged, senior officers often traced their origins back to the lessons of Milperra. The massacre had shown that waiting until shots were fired was unacceptable. The only way to keep suburban streets safe was to treat organized bikers as a standing security threat, watched, disrupted, and pressured at every turn. Media, memory, and culture. The Milperra Massacre didn't just stay in police files or court transcripts, it became part of Australia's national story. From the first hours after the shooting, newspapers and TV bulletins treated it as front-page news. Images of blood-stained cars and spent cartridges in a suburban parking lot shocked the public and dominated headlines for weeks. The sheer scale of violence, and the fact that it happened on Father's Day, made it a defining moment in modern Australian crime reporting. Over the years, Milperra continued to echo through media coverage. Every major anniversary, outlets like the ABC, SBS, and commercial networks revisited the story with retrospectives, often interviewing surviving police, witnesses, and even former club members. Documentaries dissected the trial, the gun law reforms, and the human cost, ensuring that the shootout remained a point of reference in debates about gangs and firearms. The event also moved into popular culture. In 2012, the miniseries Bikie Wars, Brothers in Arms, dramatized the conflict. introducing a new generation to the violence and rivalry that led to Milperra. Though dramatized, its wide audience proved how deeply the massacre had embedded itself in Australia's collective memory. Even on YouTube today, clips, interviews, and retrospectives on Milperra draw consistent interest, showing its lasting relevance. For Australia, Milperra is not just a police case. It is a story retold across media formats: news, documentaries, books, and television, cementing it as one of the most infamous chapters in the country's criminal history. The rivalry. After Milperra was not the end of the story. Even after the bloodshed of 1984, the rivalry between the Comancheros and Bandidos never fully disappeared. Both clubs remained active across Australia, rebuilding their numbers and influence in the years that followed. While the massacre forced them into the public spotlight, it also cemented their place as two of the country's most visible outlaw motorcycle clubs. In the decades after, tensions simmered and at times boiled over again. Police and media reports have documented later confrontations, some involving violent clashes, others centering on territory, recruitment, or criminal enterprises. None reached the same level of carnage as Milperra, but the feud's legacy could be seen whenever headlines surfaced about Bicky-related violence in Sydney or beyond. What stands out is that Milperra didn't settle the score. Instead, it created a long shadow under which both clubs operated. Each new clash was viewed through the lens of Father's Day 1984, reminding Australians how dangerous the rivalry could become if unchecked. For law enforcement and the public, the memory of Milperra kept the Comanchero-Bandido conflict under constant scrutiny, long after the smoke cleared from that suburban car park. What the numbers actually say. When historians and police talk about Milperra, the conversation often comes back to the numbers. 7 lives were lost that afternoon. 4 members of the Comancheros, 2 from the Bandidos, and 1 14-year-old girl who had nothing to do with either club. Another 28 people were left injured, many with gunshot wounds, others from blunt force attacks in the chaos of the melee. These figures made the Milperra Massacre the deadliest outlaw motorcycle gang confrontation in Australian history. No other Bicky conflict in the country has matched its immediate toll in fatalities and serious injuries. That grim ranking explains why Milperra is always referenced in debates about organized crime, public safety, and the limits of law enforcement at the time. The numbers also shaped how governments and communities understood the risk. To many Australians, the idea that an armed shootout involving dozens of men could erupt in a suburban car park on Father's Day was almost unthinkable. The official casualty count, 7 dead, 28 wounded, turned the tragedy into a national marker. Every later clash between motorcycle clubs would be compared against Milperra, ensuring that the massacre remains an unavoidable reference point in both policy discussions and public memory. Final takeaway. The Milperra Massacre was more than a violent afternoon in 1984. It marked a turning point in Australia's modern history of organized crime. It cemented the arrival of the Bandidos as a trans-Pacific force, locked in deadly rivalry with the Comancheros, and it forced New South Wales to rethink the laws that governed who could own and carry firearms. Just as importantly, it pushed police away from a reactive posture and into long-term surveillance and intelligence operations that still define how authorities track outlaw motorcycle gangs today. For many Australians, Milperra shattered the illusion that these clubs were only fringe groups on the margins. The cost in lives and the sheer scale of the violence showed how quickly rivalries could spill into the public sphere. As we move into the full story, the commitment is clear. This won't be about myths or Hollywood versions of biker wars. It's about the record, what happened, why it mattered, and how its consequences are still with us nearly 4 decades later.